Welcome. This is Leadership for Society, Race and Power. I'm Brian Lowery, professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford. And today we're talking about food and race. And I'm happy to have Tunde Wey here, a chef and activist, to talk about this important topic. Thanks for joining us, Tunde.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So first I'm going to ask, how do you define what you do? So I was like chef and activist, but I don't know if that captures what it is you do. How do you
Right.
define what you do?
Yeah, when you said activist, that made me cringe because I definitely don't call myself that. That's a lot of responsibility. I don't know. It just depends on who I'm speaking to. But I guess I'm speaking to you right now, so I should answer the question. Uh, I write, and I cook sometimes, and I'm currently working on a docu series. I'm also working on a art installation. So I don't know. There's a bunch of things that I do, and I guess I just use those things to talk about the things that I want to talk about, whether it's food or whether it's art, whether it's filmmaking or cooking.
Got it. So what I know of you is mostly the food stuff. I've seen some of the docu-series stuff. You have a great website. So if people want to check it out, it's fromlagos.com. That's right?
I hope so. I haven't checked that out in a minute. So yeah, but that's it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure when I looked it up, it was fromlagos.com. So you
Okay.
can go there
Yeah.
and check out a lot of the things that you're talking about. And a lot of it, and what you're known for, I would say most broadly is the food stuff. The things you've done on food, the things you've said about the food industry. And so let me ask a first question, which is, people just want to enjoy food. Why do you have to make it complicated? Why?
But I mean, I think that's true with anything. People want to enjoy everything. It's not just food, and people are always looking for an excuse not to think more critically. Me too, all the time. Um, I think your proximity to a certain event or a certain thing is what maybe inoculates you to the problem. So if you're like deeply embedded in something, and you see it all the time, you just become desensitized to it, especially if it doesn't affect you directly. Um, so I'm currently in Lagos. I haven't been here in 20 years. This is my second visit in 2 or 3 months, and before that, I haven't returned in 20 years. So everything here is new to me, and Nigeria, Lagos is a very class and money conscious space, and so I see all of these things that interrupt um, my experience of the city. I see people who are poor, people who are asking for money. I see people working all kinds of jobs trying to make money. I see the hustle, and it interrupts my living. So I don't have a choice, because it's something that just interrupts what I do. So I think similar with food, the things that I was talking about or have talked about are things that just personally interrupt my enjoyment. So I want to share the interruption.
I appreciate that. And we should probably do a session on travel, because I think what you're talking about is travel. And you can think about that, I guess, through food in part, but also literally like you going back to Lagos and having the way you think about things, as you described it, interrupted. I think that's a powerful experience that helps us like see more clearly the world around us. But let me go back to food for a second. And the stuff that I've seen of yours, it seems like you talk about food and race on two different levels. So one is kind of a straightforward production and consumption, right? Like how is food produced? Who's creating the food? Who gets to consume it? Who has the right to speak on the consumption? So things that's like not just the consumption, but everything that attends that, right? The writing about it, the reflecting on it, all these things. So that's one level I've seen you talk about food. And another level, it seems to be more as a metaphor. So more as an entry point for like larger issues, because you talk about things like gentrification, but using food as a way to think about that. So first, do you agree with that kind of way of thinking about what you're doing? Like at least with food, that there's production, consumption, straightforward discussions you have, and then there's the kind of food as a metaphor or an entry point to larger social issues. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think about it in like multiple, many ways. But yeah, those two sound good. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
It
And
just depends
then
on what the next question is.
yeah, I'm not gonna catch you up in another question, but here's the next question. Um, do you always think the personal is political and vice versa? Is there something uniquely powerful about food as a metaphor, as an entry point? So it's because you do a lot of things as you already described, but you've it's interesting that you chose food as a major component, right? That's not
Yeah,
always a
I
major
mean,
component.
even to the project I'm doing this gallery show in Milwaukee later this month, and I'm using salt, so I'm selling salt, and it's like folks can bid on the salt, and each subsequent bid on it's like a box of salt. Each subsequent bid is 107% more than the previous bid, so the price goes up by 107%, and that reflects the racial wage disparity in Milwaukee. And then the object is salt. So food is like the major component in the work that I'm doing, whether it's the art or the docu series. It's also it's about food. So I yeah, food is sort of central. But now I think I lost your question.
Yeah, I'm just
Oh,
curious.
is it personal or political? Yeah.
Yeah,
Um, the answer is yes. I think that all of our like what becomes like concretized into politics, like capital P or small p politics, is, I mean, I believe this strongly, is like personal preferences. I When I think about race and I think about like the not like race as a construct, but then the construct that reinforces race, I think about it. I think about its starting point as the um, the sort of evangelical mission that it took to spread one group's preferences across like a vast area, and then to like institute all of these systems to maintain those preferences as predominant. And so if I have a certain set of preferences that are personal, that then take up space in people's lives and then become an imposition, my preferences have become political, and that's what it is. I think that's what power is. Power is about the establishment of personal preferences over a public.
hmm that leads me actually to another question. So I'm going to jump the question I had and come back to the one I had planned. But that makes me think about the question of provenance, right? Of provenance of food, right? So,
Yeah.
um, how should we think about concepts like ownership and appropriation when we think about something as fluid as food, right? Food is changing every time someone cooks a meal, it changes. Recipes are constantly evolving, but there's certainly a sense of ownership of food. And when you think about the kind of
Yeah.
preferences, when you talked about preferences, right? You're talking about like there's implied in that ownership of
Yeah.
preferences and propagating of my group's preferences, and dominating others, and through those kind of personal preferences, right? Of signaling who owns what. How do we think about that in the context of food?
Yeah. I think there was, and I'm sure it'll come again. It's sort of cyclical. This question of appropriation in food, um, like that. Every couple of years, there's some white person that has been caught stealing some, black or brown person's recipe and trying to commercialize it. Um, and then people fall on different sides of the argument. Like, well, can anybody really own this? What's wrong in me? Trying out this recipe or doing something. I think everything or most things are contextual. And I think the first question is really to ask, like, well, who's benefiting? You know, and the second mistake is like folks often, and folks including myself, always conflate like the personal with like the public, or the informal with the formal. And so if you if you challenge, the public consumption of, say, a particular kind of food that is indigenous to, say, Black folks in the United States, if you challenge the public consumption, the pushback you get usually is, say, from white people instituting or asserting their personal informal preference. And they'll be like, so you're telling me that I can't cook this food in my home? But that's not the question, right? The question isn't like what you do in your private domain. The question is like is the influence and impact of your private choices on the public. And so if you're a famous chef and you're cooking from a culture that isn't yours, and from a culture that has been historically been stolen from, and then you're profiting actively, in my mind, that's a problem. But then again, like personally, I had a friend who used this expression, like that's not a hill that I'm willing to die on. There are other things that are happening, but it is a problem, and there are people who are working on that and who are fighting or dialoguing or doing whatever it takes to get people to understand or to challenge that behavior. But I think where I am now is it's not what I think about personally. I want to go to the source, or what I think is the source, which is consumption, which is capitalism, which are these like larger global systems, rather than talk about some individual chef who might be powerful. Like there's a fellow who owns a bunch of Mexican restaurants. I forget his name, Rick Bayless, I think. And he's usually used as an example of somebody who is appropriating. He's also used as an example of somebody who is paying homage to the culture. I'm less interested in him, and the people who are interested in him should be, but I'm personally interested in what he represents and how he came to be collected into this person that has this power to do these things. And that's about capital. That's about like global capitalism and global racism and all that.
So you see him, like when you talk about that person, Rick, I think you said his name is, he represents to you the larger system. Is that what you're responding to?
Maybe this is like a turn of phrase. I don't know if he represents, but he's representative of. I don't want to imbue him with more power, also more responsibility than he deserves. But yeah, he's representative of a system. There are forces that create the things that bother us, and I'm interested in those forces, and less so, at least now, in the individual. I think in my work, in my writing, because I do that too, I have in the past, and I'm sure I will again in the future, hopefully not too much, like single out people as individuals and sort of like problematize them. But that is just a rhetorical device. It's not, it's an unfortunate rhetorical device because I have to pick people. And I'm sure my time is coming when I'm picked, but it's true. But I think those devices are necessary because of the way we understand language and stories. We need those archetypes to be able to offer the moral,
Yeah, I like the way you're talking about that, because I do, the stuff I've seen of yours seems like it takes the personal and tries to clarify the political, right? So when you're selling the salt at, and then 107% each bid is going up, it's a personal bid, but it's an attempt to, it seems to me, like from the outside anyway, an attempt to open people's minds to the broader social context or that they're living in. But when you do it that way, it really, because it leans so hard on the personal, like, and you said it's unfortunate, but it's a rhetorical tool that you're using. So I get that. But it also seems like it has the potential for both dividing us and maybe more interestingly, dividing us around an issue or a topic, food, that also has the ability to unite. And I'm thinking about this because the last time the last person I talked to was basically a historian of music, right? And this came up with him. I talked to him about this, right? Like music is this interesting thing. I think it's similar to food in some ways, and it has this paradoxical quality, right? Where music brings us together. Like everyone can understand the language of music and enjoy that, so it can connect you. But it also divides us, right? We have a sense of ownership, a sense of identity that's tied to our music, and it's like a sense of our music, right? Like this is who I am, my culture, and how do we manage that? And so I wonder if you see food in the same way, right? There's this deeply communal aspect, but also this way in which it can divide us. And in fact, it feels like you are poking at the places where it divides us to make a point. Does that
Yeah.
seem like what you're doing?
Well, I don't know that you did something here so brilliantly. You started off like with an assumption that sounded like a fact, and then you sort of like shifted it back to an assumption. That's brilliant. And the assumption is that that I'm using food to divide us, or like or food or and also that food brings us together. Like, food doesn't do anything that people don't do. Like food isn't magical. You're not gonna people aren't gonna be fighting a war and you just throw some bread on and they just stop and like start singing a song. Like that's not gonna happen. Or people aren't going to be sort of like in love and then you throw some bread and then they sort of like break up. So we already divided, uh, and we are also in community depending on where we are, and what the context is. I mean, there's at least from my perspective, there's nothing. So there's sort of like only romance that there is to food is the romance that as me the object, I mean me the subject, like conjures up, and then you also conjure up like your romance. Like food is an object. It does what it does, and all the things that are happening, um, you know, are gonna happen. But even like let's even like let me just step away from this metaphysical shit and just be specific. There is like food is a source of conflict. You know, like the primary resource that we are all scrambling for is food. Like we're scrambling for money so that we can buy the things that we need. But ultimately, especially with the way the world is changing, it comes down to food. So I'm here in Lagos. We travel to the center of Nigeria, or the middle belt, Kogi. It's a rice farming community by myself and my partner, my film partner Ruth, and we were in this community with smallholder farmers talking about food, talking about how because of climate change, they had like the worst flooding, that wiped away crops. Like people are, like that impoverished people. That created a ripple effect. That changed the landscape. And all of these tensions are around food and what food does. All of these um, um, this despair is around food. Folks who are trying to access capital, access inputs like fertilizer and seed, and machinery to cultivate. All of these struggles are happening right now, and they're happening around food. What is not happening is in certain places like the United States, but in certain communities in those places, this struggle is obscured because, as some brilliant thinker has said before, is that like the colonial or the capitalist center exports those externalities. They export it. In the U.S. they export it to Black and Brown and indigenous communities, but the U.S. as a whole exports it to Black and Brown countries. But even in those Black and Brown countries, even here in Nigeria, the largest, blackest country in the world, you have an elite that is exporting it out to like the majority of the people. And even that majority is exporting it out to like the rural majority. So it's this uh, continuous deflection, so that by the time food gets to our plates in spaces where we're comfortable, we can say things like, well, why don't we just enjoy and forget, like food should bring us together? Well,
Mhm.
that's because you can't say that.
Yeah, that's a powerful message. I see that. And so I think this leads to a question that I think is seems really important to you. So there's across your webpage, there's a message about reparations, right? So
Mm-hmm.
to the Black and Indigenous people of the world, like reparations are due. And so how when you think about that, what is due? So what would the what would a just reparations look like from your perspective?
So I think that's an economics question. And there are people, like prominent people, talking about this. There's Sandy Darity, and he has a partner. I forget his name. So excuse me. They've done
Mhm.
extensive work on reparations. They have proposals like baby bonds and other things. And some of the proposals aren't even like race-based reparations. They're just like, class-based uh, incentives, or reparative programs. So so in terms of the actual logistics of what reparations look like, there are folks who are working on that, but that's in the U.S. context. There was a there was a plan called the Lagos Plan of Action. I think it was written in the 70s. I'm not sure. It was put together by the African Union. This was like post-independence. Like there
Mhm.
was this moment where post-independence, like all these African countries were like, we need to create an order that's different. And in there, they talk about reparations. Because I tell like my friends here in Nigeria that Nigeria has about 200 or so million people. The US has about 300 or so million people. The US's GDP is 21 times larger than Nigeria's GDP. Um, that gap is not a gap of incompetence. It's just not possible. Like you cannot find somebody that is a country that is so incompetent that it's 21 times worse than another country. It's just like, I mean, that's just what, or to put it a different way, because people might disagree with that. You can't tell me that America is 21 times smarter or better or uh, more just or moral than Nigeria. I think that's not true. So it's
Mhm.
not an incompetence gap or corruption gap. It's theft. That's just what it is. Or the relocation of resources, the mass relocation of resources from one place to another. The same thing in the U.S. where the racial wealth disparity is 10 times between that of like white and black folks, and also white and Latino folks, white and indigenous folks. Like that gap is predicated, the foundation is theft.
Mhm.
Um, and there are all of these like questions, all of these like administrative responses to this like fundamental questions. Like, well, let's work on, depending on who the victim is. Like, well, let's work on job programs, or let's institute like these bilateral loans. Like, that's not the issue. My mother tells me that her mother told her that you can't afford to put money in the bank that you keep staring at, right? The reason why people get into debt, the reason why people don't have money is because they don't have money. That's just what it is. So trying to like help them without giving them money is crazy, especially if the money that they need to get to where they're going to, you took from them in the first place.
Mhm.
And this is on a intercommunal level in the United States. This is an intercontinental level with the United States and the West as well.
Yeah, I mean,
So
we're
yes,
getting
reparations.
yeah. So I think it's a powerful argument. We're getting away from food, but I'm gonna follow up on that a bit. Um, is it just a question of economics? Because earlier on you made a point about the way capitalism works, right? But when we're talking about reparations this way, it sounds like an acceptance of the capitalist system, but an intervention in terms of a current distribution of resources. Is that what you have in mind, or do you have in mind something more than that?
I think I have in mind something more. I just don't know what the more is because I'm not learned enough. I think I need to read more Marx or something, or start reading Marx. But I do think it happens in this is my mind, and maybe I could learn better. But I think it happens in the stages. We do need to redistribute resources fundamentally, and this is my nihilist perspective: is that if we redistributed resources and we sort of like raise the level of consumption for everybody, then we could experience the consequences of this like over consumptive society that we have. And then those consequences will hopefully either like, destroy us or like spur us to think about doing things differently. So I think our first step is resource redistribution.
Got it.
And then I think, yeah, and then we need to address consumption for sure.
Mm-hmm. And so taking it back to food and some of the things that you've done, right? So you've mentioned the salt thing you have coming up in Milwaukee, but you also did this thing with hot chicken. I assume it was in Nashville, but I'm not. Was it in Nashville?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
yeah.
was in Nashville.
Right. Where you had differential pricing, right, for hot chicken, and it was really extortionist prices for this is how you described it to make a point, right? So you can you tell us just quickly about how that project worked?
Yeah. So well, there was a problem in that, black there's a black neighborhood or black neighborhoods in Nashville were getting gentrified, North Nashville, like historically black neighborhoods. And they were getting gentrified in the most casual way. People were offering folks money, people were moving in and then, changing the culture of the community and folks had to move out. Or taxes were rising, and if you're on a fixed income, maybe you can't keep up with taxes. All that to say is that the system was working efficiently. And so the question was how do you like shock people into like recognizing that this efficient system is deeply racist and problematic. And then also, how do you divert resources again back to this idea of reparations? How do you divert resources to these communities? And hot chicken is a big thing in Nashville. Hot chicken is also a thing that has been appropriated by white folks. Like I think that one of the biggest hot chicken chain is Hattie B's. But the original hot chicken is Prince's, and of course Hattie B's is white owned. Anyway, so I decided to make my own version of hot chicken, Nigerian hot chicken. I basically made something called suya, but I freaked it, and I sold it. So I was selling it to people who would buy it for. I asked for the deed to a home, for a whole chicken. I asked for like $100,000 for like a thigh, for like a wing. But that was all like, it was preposterous, of course. Who would willingly buy a chicken for a home? But what I was doing, because that was the sort of the public facing side of the work. What I was actually doing while I was there I was just like meeting with all these like community leaders and folks who had resources and trying to create, maybe folks in the business school know this, like a capital stack. Like how do we get debt financing, then equity financing and all these levels and grants and all that shit, and get enough money to buy up all the homes in that community, and then transfer the ownership to the Black folks there, and then by instituting what is called a community land trust. So basically, we would purchase the homes from Black folks, give them the money back, and then have their homes be in a community land trust that they own. So they still stay in their homes and they have the ownership in those homes. But then when they pass away, it's there's sort of like there's a covenant that only a certain kind of person can live there, and that person has to make a certain kind of income. So you maintain the the racial and cultural character of that neighborhood, and so that was the idea, and it wasn't very successful in that like only one person bid, but it was a big bite, at least for the individual, and they ended up buying essentially a piece of chicken for $100,000. you know.
Mhm.
But all of that is about like the scale of the problem is preposterous, you know. So like my response to it is like to be equally, you know, incredulous with the things that I'm doing, the things that I'm saying. And I just want to say one thing about reparations and food. You know, when we're talking about this like global stuff, like it does come back to food, because food comes back to money. Like you have, how does the US government say, how do they offer aid in certain countries? They offer food, you know, they ship in food. The United States government is not like, doesn't own farms. They're not making this food, right? They get the food from farmers, the farmers who are already heavily subsidized, whose crops already like come into countries, into black and brown countries, and depress prices for indigenous farmers. So this global system, um, and this global system that deserves reparations, is about food. It's about consumption.
So a lot of this actually talks about, or a lot of things you're saying implies something about white folks or colonialist countries, in the US right now, big capitalist countries. And as someone who talks and writes about white privilege, I'm sure you get more than your fair share of pushback, hate mail, etc. Um, what is it that you want people on the positive side of the current ledger, the people who are benefiting the most? What do you want them to think about the system? What do you want? What are you trying to tell them? Are you speaking to them at all?
I don't know. I mean, should everybody does what they want to do. You know, I don't know. To be honest, like I'm just more concerned with like the global order now. You know, and what that means. I'll give you an example of what's happening. So in Nigeria right now, the economy is Nigeria is a, what do they call it, a petro economy, or petrodollar economy. So we export crude oil. That's like our biggest export. It's our biggest source of foreign currency. Foreign currency is US dollars. The US the US runs a deficit, right? And basically the US exports its dollars. Like the global system is the US dollar based system. And why that is important is because we don't set US monetary policy, right? So US monetary policy, whatever happens there affects us, because when the price of the dollar rises relative to the naira, which is our currency, then food prices shoot up. When the price of crude drops, you know, again because of US policy, and we can't get forex, then food prices go up because we don't have the dollars. We are not food sufficient, so we import food. We have to import food with dollars. So when I start thinking about these things, I'm less interested in what somebody in like Connecticut or, you know, Denver or Detroit is thinking, like on an individual scale. I'm thinking about like systemically, how do we address this? So I think I I guess folks just need to do whatever makes them comfortable, because that's what they're doing anyway. And I'm doing the same. I'm trying to do things that make me comfortable, and part of that comfort is like trying to find a way to address these things. I'm not really trying to talk to anybody. If what I say makes people do some research and think or live differently, then that's cool, you know.
All right. So, given what's going on right now in the world, right? So, at least in the states and actually other places around the world, is this really a new or renewed focus, or a cyclical focus on racial disparities, racial injustice. So, the Black Lives Matter movement is obviously, it's been huge in the states and is taken off in other places around the world. Are you optimistic about this current moment? Do you think, are you pessimistic about the future? Where are you? How do you think about where we are right now in terms of issues of of racial and more broadly global justice?
Can I ask you a personal question?
Of course.
How old are you?
I'm 47.
Okay, I'm 37. You live 10 years more than me. And so you've seen more than me. Are you optimistic?
It's a great question. I've been doing these I've done a number of these conversations. And so the people who listen to this will know I'm not the most optimistic person. No, I see cycles. I think what it would take to change is more than many people will feel comfortable doing, to your point of comfort. So I tend, here's what I would say. I would like to be optimistic, but with a rudimentary knowledge of history, it's hard for me. That's what I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I totally agree with you. The thing that I think about, like a way for this to work, like to break the wheel, if you watch Game of Thrones, is
Mm,
like we just need to address consumption. Like the part of the part of what I think the problem is that we have this idea of what it takes to be satisfied. But the idea is that basket of goods and services is just too big, and it's not it doesn't it's not possible that for everybody to have that basket. And so like if we can start retraining ourselves around what we consider valuable, if we have some sort of, I know this sounds very crazy, but if we have some sort of public consensus about what is acceptable, what is like a human right, access to food, water, shelter, leisure, work, um, like if we can all agree on what that is, and then and solve for those things, um, then it's possible to begin to talk about equity or equality. But it's like the game is the game is crazy. Like we keep raising the stakes about what we need to be happy, and then the gap between those who have and don't have just keeps widening, and we keep trying to like close it, but it doesn't close. It just keeps moving and widening. And even
mm,
the folks at the bottom, whatever the bottom is, like say in the United States, that consumption is also like detrimental, like and that has effects on has broader effects. So yeah, I think that we're all responsible, and maybe the answer to your previous question about what I want people to do is like, and this is what I want to do to myself. It's like we all need to become more politicized, and I don't mean like voting. I mean we all need to like raise our consciousnesses. So in all the different directions, whether it's around gender issues or issues about um, economic justice, racial justice, like that's the work that needs to be done, I think.
yeah, I know I hear you. I think you do then need to talk to people like people who are on the positive side of the ledger. That would include um, not just white folks in the U.S. or the U.S. But it also includes people like me, right? People who are benefiting and you get accustomed to a certain level of consumption, right? And that really is not. I agree with you. That's probably not sustainable at a global level, right? Or there are costs to that degree of consumption
It's
that other people are bearing.
definitely not sustainable. Not
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah, not sustainable. And it's the other people are bearing that cost, right? And you don't have to see it clearly. And I think that's tough. So I don't know. It seems like you do want to talk to people like me, people on the
Yeah,
positive side of the ledger.
I do. That's
Yeah.
why I'm here.
All right. It's been great to talk to you. Like, stay on the line for a little bit. I'm gonna um, just give a couple announcements, and then I'd love to follow up with you. So, if you enjoyed this podcast, please look for other of our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. Next time, we'll be talking about sports. So, thanks for joining, and have a great week.